Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, and my newsletter are focused on helping you discover the secrets of innovation in the age of AI. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank our customers who bring me onto their programs for 10 to 12 weeks as a technical product accelerator, working alongside their teams to help them develop products smarter and faster without adding risks, while bringing human-centered AI skills into their organizations. You can learn more at www.innoguide.net. In this episode, number 82, we'll be sharing part 2 of the Zero Marginal Cost Society by Jeremy Rifkin. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Chapter 10. Although the commons is often treated today like some quaint relic, something that belonged to feudal fields and medieval villages, it's actually one of humanity's oldest, most durable ways of organizing economic life. Long before capitalism, communities governed shared resources with rules, norms, and enforcement that worked, sometimes for centuries. Yet modern culture has been trained to distrust the commons. Thanks first to Enlightenment thinkers, and later to economists who insisted that private property and markets were the only serious governing system. The most famous takedown is Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. Hardin asks us to picture an open pasture available to all herders. Each herder gains by adding one more cow, but the costs of overgrazing are spread across everyone. Predictably, each person keeps adding animals, racing for short-term advantage until the land is ruined. Hardin adds the free rider problem. Even if some herders try to steward the pasture, others can exploit their restraint. His conclusion is bleak. Commons freedom leads to ruin, and we need a coercive, external, top-down authority to prevent collapse. Hardin isn't wrong that ungoverned open access can be destructive, but he commits a fatal omission. He leaves out governance itself, the self-regulating protocols, the monitoring, and the penalties that real commons communities historically created as a condition of participation. In other words, he describes a commons with no rules, and then declares the commons unworkable. And here's what I find truly strange. Hardin casts the commons as the villain behind modern greed and destruction, when it was far more often the market-driven pursuit of profit, frequently backed by colonial and neo-colonial state power, that pillaged resources and exploited populations across the developing world for 2 centuries. Over the past few decades, scholars have begun to reopen the case. In 1986, a law professor, Carol Rose, jolted the discussion with her essay, The Comedy of the Commons, arguing that not everything fits neatly into private ownership. Oceans, waterways, forests, roads, bridges, even the air, these are inherently public goods, often governed through customary rights that predate modern states. These customs aren't just vague ideals. They typically come with management protocols to protect the shared resource. Rose reminds us that we become so accustomed to defining property as the right to exclude that we forget the older meaning, the customary right of access, navigation, passage, gathering, assembly. Her most brilliant insight comes through the public square. In social spaces, festivals, promenades, communal gatherings, the value often increases with participation. The more people who join, the more valuable it becomes. The reverse of tragedy, a comedy of the commons. The more the merrier. Written before the World Wide Web, it reads today like a prophecy about networked life. Then, in 1990, Elinor Ostrom published The Governing of the Commons, the most comprehensive analysis of commons governance across cultures and centuries, later earning her the Nobel Prize. Ostrom's work demolishes the claim that the commons inevitably collapse. Studying resources like fisheries, forests, and irrigation systems, from Swiss Alps to Japanese villages, she found that communities routinely choose long-term preservation over short-term gain, held together by trust, feedback, and shared rules. Violations are monitored mostly by members themselves. Sanctions exist, but are often modest, with shame and social accountability doing much of the work. One vivid case is Torbel, Switzerland, about 600 people sustaining a commons for over 800 years. Families farm private plots, but share alpine meadows for summer grazing. A centuries updated covenant sets boundaries, restricts overgrazing, and no one can send more cows to the Alp than they can feed in the winter. And it allocates cheese based on counted herds. The association meets, elects officials, maintains infrastructure, and assigns timber trees by lot, and funds work through proportional fees. It's a mixed system, private land where it makes sense, commons where shared stewardship produces better outcomes, and it has delivered productivity and quality of life that, frankly, is an advertisement for sustainability. Ostrom distilled patterns like these into 7 design principles: clear boundaries, well-defined appropriation rules, democratic rulemaking, accountable monitoring, graduated sanctions, low-cost conflict resolution, and government recognition of the commons' legitimacy. Laboratory experiments reinforce the point: when people can communicate and make their own rules, overuse drops dramatically, and they will even pay a cost to sanction violators. So why the renewed interest now? Because deregulation and privatization accelerated in the Reagan-Thatcher era and normalized even by progressive market-friendly leaders, hollowed out governments, and handed vast public trust to corporate power. Communities squeezed between bureaucratic misfit on one side and corporate enclosure on the other began searching for a third model: democratic, collaborative, locally grounded. At the same time, environmental degradation and climate disruption made local resilience urgent. And finally, the enclosure push has reached the deepest layers of reality: genes, the electromagnetic spectrum, even atomic scale processes. My own entry in this battle came with the Chakrabarty case, when the Supreme Court narrowly opened the door to patenting engineered life. We warned of a parade of horribles, and soon it arrived: gene patents, bioprospecting, and a global race to convert life's building blocks into intellectual property. That struggle drove me back to the commons, not as nostalgia, but as necessity, especially as technologies drive marginal cost towards zero and a new generation insists that open access and peer-to-peer governance may be the most human, the most practical way forward. Chapter 11. The Collaboratists Prepare for Battle. The new commoners aren't merely forming another political movement. They're the leading edge of a deep social transformation, the kind that reorients how a civilization understands itself. I suspect its consequences will prove as enduring as the shift that carried us from a theological worldview into the ideological age that accompanied the rise of capitalism. At the center of this transformation is a looming conflict: prosumer collaboratists versus investor capitalists. It's still early, but make no mistake, this is shaping up to be the defining economic battle of the first half of the 21st century. In the first industrial revolution, a new communication energy matrix helped sever workers from their tools and separated shareholder investors from the day-to-day management of the enterprises they owned. Now the third industrial revolution matrix is reversing the flow. The new infrastructure is enabling consumers to become producers, prosumers, who collaborate in distributed peer-to-peer network commons, sharing goods and services at near zero marginal cost. That kind of abundance doesn't politely compete with markets, it disrupts them at the core. If there's one phrase that captures the emerging cultural storyline, it's the democratization of everything. And 3 movements, free culture, environmentalism, and the struggle to reclaim the public commons, are increasingly co-producing this drama. Each began with its own language and metaphors, but they've started borrowing from one another, merging into a shared frame. For the free culture movement, the trigger moment came when one of the young stars of the computing revolution drew a hard boundary. In 1976, Bill Gates, still an outsider, still young, lashed out at the hacker culture, accusing hobbyists of stealing software and warning that without payment, there would be very little incentive to share code. Gates wasn't just venting, he was signaling that the playful, collaborative university culture at places like MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Stanford was about to be pulled into the marketplace. Richard Stallman at MIT's AI lab took the challenge head-on. He argued that software code was quickly becoming a language of communication between people and machines, and that enclosing it behind proprietary walls wasn't merely inconvenient, it was unethical. Stallman's rallying cry wasn't free beer, it was free speech. So he built a practical alternative. the GNU operating system, and in 1985, the Free Software Foundation, grounded in 4 freedoms. Run the program for any purpose, study and change it, redistribute copies to help your neighbor, and distribute modified versions so the community benefits. Then Stallman did something ingenious. He used copyright law against itself. Through the GNU General, and that's spelled GNU, through the GNU General Public License, the GPL, he created copyleft, a licensing system that permits reproduction and modification but requires that derivative works remain under the same open terms. The GPL became a legal engine for a software commons, complete with inclusion rights, access rights, and enforcement logic, echoing, in its own way, the design features Elinor Ostrom found in successful commons governance. 6 years later, Linus Torvalds released the Linux kernel under the GPL, making it compatible with GNU and allowing thousands of prosumers to improve the code collaboratively over the Internet. The implications were stunning. GNU Linux now powers the overwhelming majority of the world's top supercomputers and runs across enterprise systems and embedded devices. As Eben Moglen observed, the GPL meant contributors could be confident no one would privatize their collective labor, and the Internet enabled a scale of largely non-hierarchical collaboration that proprietary firms simply couldn't match. Not everyone agreed on framing. In 1998, Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens launched the Open Source Initiative, arguing that the moral language of free software frightened businesses. They wanted a term that made collaboration sound like a practical methodology, not a social revolution. Stallman warned that stripping away the philosophy weakened the movement and invited slow erosion, because businesses would happily adopt open tools, then later tempt users back into the proprietary systems. Still, open source spread rapidly, pulling in commercial actors without abandoning the licensed foundations. Then the Internet matured, and what began as a battle over code became a battle over culture. Social media turned the net into a global public square where people share music, photos, videos, news, and ideas, creating social capital more than market capital. A kind of global consciousness began emerging, driven by billions of amateurs participating in the largest democratization of culture in history. But the medium shapes the domain. Print culture individualized authorship, encouraged copyright, and privatized communication, one author speaking one way to one isolated reader. The Internet does the opposite. It dissolves boundaries, invites mixing and remix conversation, and makes sharing feel as natural as speech because copying is nearly free. That's why Lawrence Lessig and colleagues founded Creative Commons in 2001, offering some rights reserved licenses that let creators choose how others may share or remix their work. Lessig's favorite example is beautifully simple. Colin Mulcher uploads a guitar track. A 17-year-old violinist, Cora Beth, downloads it, adds violin, and renames it My Life Changed, and re-uploads it for others to build on. Creative collaboration without lawyers blocking the flow. The Creative Commons exploded. Hundreds of millions of works, vast pools of licensed photos on Flickr, millions of videos on YouTube, Wikipedia's relicensing, and it even reached into science where researchers argue that patents and restrictive copyrights slow collaboration. Harvard Medical School's Personal Genome Project, for example, lets Creative Commons users place genome data in the public domain to accelerate discovery. Yet, legal tools aren't enough. A common society needs a narrative, a worldview. That missing story pushed thinkers like James Boyle to talk about a second enclosure movement and to imagine a future where creative and inventive production is freer, more distributed, and low cost in a world of near zero marginal cost. Boyle looked to environmentalism for a systems theory, and in truth, the frame is larger still. Biosphere itself, ecology. From Vernadsky's biosphere to Lovelock and McGill's Gaia hypothesis, teaches that life is a web of symbiotic feedback loops. Undermine the balance through greenhouse gases and ecosystem disruption, and you destabilize the whole thing. Here's where the commons conversation stops being abstract. Conservation easements operate like environmental Creative Commons licenses. My wife and I placed land near Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains into a conservation easement, turning it into a wildlife refuge. Black bear, white-tailed deer, red foxes, wild turkeys, raccoons. We still own the land, but we can't subdivide it or develop it in certain ways. Ownership is separated from exclusive use, and some rights are returned to the public trust. An intentional, partial reopening of enclosure. By the late 1990s, this commons affliction, as my friends teased, was spreading everywhere, especially as globalization became a euphemism for deregulation and privatization. The turning point came in Seattle in 1999 when tens of thousands protested the WTO World Trade Organization using early digital tools, email, chat room, live internet broadcasts, virtual sit-ins, cell phones to coordinate. They were reacting not only to resource enclosure, but also to laws like the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act and the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which claimed to lock down culture with digital rights management. The question after Seattle was no longer just what people opposed, but what they were for. And the answer rising into view was unmistakable. Reopen the commons. The struggle ahead won't be settled by slogans. In the real world, it will pivot on infrastructure, what we build, who governs it, and whether the coming communications energy system is designed for enclosures and tolls or for lateral collaborative abundance. Chapter 12. The Struggle to Define and Control the Intelligent Infrastructure. Yochai Benkler is one of the most eloquent champions of commons governance, and he's absolutely right about one crucial point. A networked information economy rich in social production can't truly flourish if it's built atop proprietary choke points. Benkler argues we need a core common infrastructure, physical, logical, and content resources that are open for everyone to use so people can create information, encode it, transmit it, and receive it. I'm with him, but Brett Fishman raises the uncomfortable question Benkler doesn't fully answer. What exactly counts as core infrastructure, and how do we secure sustainable public access to it? Once you agree something is foundational, you still have to decide the institutional means of commons management. Open wireless and public provisioning help, yes. Even the FCC's proposal for unlicensed spectrum and a free nationwide Wi-Fi network reflects how far these arguments have traveled. Still, the real failure of imagination is bigger. It's the tendency to talk about communications infrastructure as if it can be separated from the energy regime beneath it. The great economic revolutions aren't just communications revolutions, they are infrastructure revolutions, and what makes them transformative is the convergence of new communications media with new energy regimes. Try running a steam-powered urban industrial society without steam printing and the telegraph. Try organizing an oil and auto mass consumer culture without centralized electricity, the telephone, radio, and television. The pattern is relentless. So here's the hard question. Can a distributed peer-to-peer communications common really thrive if the country remains yoked to a centralized fossil fuel energy regime that demands vast infusions of finance capital and favors vertical integration? Would that entrenched energy order ever welcome a communications revolution that could help manage renewable energy peer-to-peer, enable 3D printing, and push marginal costs towards zero, thereby threatening the profit logic of the existing system? By contrast, internet-style communications are perfectly suited to renewable energy because the renewables are distributed by nature and work best when managed collaboratively and scaled laterally. That's why the foundational infrastructure of the coming era is not just the internet. It's three interlocking internets: a communications internet, an energy internet, and a logistics internet, integrated into a single interactive system, the Internet of Things. When those systems talk to one another, they generate a continuous stream of big data about how society moves, powers itself, and produces data that can be shared on a global commons to drive extreme productivity and move toward a near-zero marginal cost society. And this is where the real battle begins. The struggle to define and control the governance of these three internets is being waged aggressively by governments, capitalist enterprises, and the emerging social economy of the commons. The communications commons, neutrality versus enclosure. Up till now, the Internet has been governed as a hybrid commons involving government, business, and civil society. Technical standards have largely been handled by nonprofit bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force, the World Wide Web Consortium, and ICANN, now overseen by an international board rather than the U.S. government. The broader governance question erupted at the UN World Summit on the Information Society in Geneva in 2003, producing the now famous three-stakeholder definition of Internet governance, that tripartite. Model matters. Civil society is not decorative. It is essential to legitimacy in a medium built on peer-to-peer participation. The Internet Governance Forum, IGF, was created under a UN umbrella to keep deliberation networked rather than purely top-down. Yet, pressures are mounting from both directions. Some governments, worried about taxation, intellectual property, cyber attacks, and political dissent, are pushing for sovereign control with proposals that sidestep multi-stakeholder governance entirely. Meanwhile, the private sector has its own agenda, price discrimination, and the undermining of network neutrality. Network neutrality grew out of the Internet's end-to-end design. Once you're connected, your packets should be treated like everyone else's. But telecom and cable firms want to prioritize traffic for a fee, charge application tolls, and block some services in favor of others. AT&T's Ed Whittaker famously complained about my pipes, insisting others shouldn't use them for free, even though providers are already paid for transmission. Europe saw similar fights. Dutch Telecom, controlling a large share of Germany's connections, proposed download caps and pay-to-upgrade schemes, while exempting its own services and disadvantaging competitors like Google and YouTube, prompting regulatory scrutiny. And then there's enclosure from the inside. Tim Berners-Lee warned that major platforms, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, are walling off user information, building data silos. You can browse web pages, but your data doesn't travel with you because it lacks portable URLs. The more you contribute, the more you're locked in. The web fragments into enclosed spaces where big data is mined and sold. Well, when Google fields billions of queries a day and Facebook connects over 1 billion people, these aren't minor companies. They begin to resemble essential facilities. That's why some are now calling not only for network neutrality, but search neutrality, even algorithm neutrality, because algorithms are not neutral. They encode choices, incentives, and sometimes bias. The deeper issue is what Zeynep Tufekci calls the corporatization of the commons, social connection for users, profit maximization for platform owners. The energy commons, prosumers versus centralized utilities. The energy internet faces its own enclosure attempts. Some utilities block distributed renewables. Others try to force a centralized smart grid where data flows only one way up to headquarters so prosumers can't see real-time prices or choose optimal times to share power. The EU has pushed back with unbundling rules separating generation from transmission to reduce discriminatory grid access. And as feed-in tariffs spread, more transmission companies are being forced to adapt their business models toward managing efficiency and selling less electricity more intelligently. Here I return to a history lesson with present-day consequences. Rural electrification in the United States. Private utilities refused to serve rural America. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, authorized in 1933, proved the case for cheap power as a public good, and the Rural Electric Administration, the REA, created in 1935, solved the scale problem by backing local cooperatives, nonprofit, self-managed commons institutions financed largely through low-interest loans. Farmers built lines at lower costs, electrified the countryside in little more than a decade, improved productivity and quality of life, and even boosted appliance markets by pushing manufacturers to make cheaper goods. Hotelling's argument about broad spillover benefits largely proved correct, yet it was the commons cooperative model supported by government that delivered. Today, that cooperative logic is reemerging as the best fit for an economy where marginal costs fall towards zero. Green energy cooperatives are proliferating, EcoPower in Belgium, hundreds of new co-ops. In Germany, Denmark's community-owned wind turbines, and Somoso's 10-year transformation to 100% renewables. Because community ownership builds trust and buy-in. Even U.S. rural electric co-ops are moving aggressively into renewables and smart meters. The logistics commons, an internet for moving things. The third piece is the logistics internet. Our current privately managed trucks half full, empty return miles, bloated inventory, underused warehouses, and fragmented standards, all driving costs and carbon emissions. Logistics isn't a side issue, it's the connective tissue of the entire economy. Researchers like Benoit Montreal proposed borrowing the Internet's open architecture logic, standardized modular containers with sensors, shared protocols, distributed multi-segment routing. Instead of point-to-point halls, open access to vast networks of warehouses and distribution centers. In his example, a long Quebec to Los Angeles trip becomes a relay of local drivers, cutting delivery time roughly in half while sending each driver home the same day. The technology exists, what's missing is common standards, and commons-style governance, likely through cooperatives. The core governance challenge, managing congestion, not depletion. And notice something profound. Unlike traditional commons, focused on preventing depletion of physical stock, these three infrastructure commons must manage temporal resources, preventing congestion, data traffic, peak electricity loads, transport flows. Without commons governance, every private actor optimizes its own flow and everyone suffers congestion, a tragedy of unmanaged networks. This is why the Internet of Things infrastructure doesn't simply support the collaborative commons, it decides its fate. The intelligent infrastructure will either be enclosed for tolls and monopoly rents, or governed openly, collaboratively, and democratically to unlock the next great leap toward a near-zero marginal cost society. Chapter 13. The Transformation from Ownership to Access. If private property is the hallmark of capitalism, then the privately owned automobile has been its signature icon, especially in places like the U.S., where freedom has long been defined as autonomy, self-sufficiency, and the right to exclude. Nothing captures that old story better than being alone behind the wheel of your own enclosed machine, empowered by horsepower, able to go anywhere on your schedule. The car, in that sense, became the ultimate enclosure, a rolling island that perfectly expressed the capitalist-era idea that to be free is to be independent and not beholden to others. But that definition of freedom is being rewritten by the Internet generation. For millennials, freedom is increasingly understood not as the right to exclude, but as the right to be included, connected to networks, communities, and relationships. The optimal life is measured less by what you own and more by the diversity of experiences you can access and the breadth of your social reach. In that worldview, access beats ownership. And this isn't just a theory. It shows up in behavior. In one survey of drivers aged 18 to 24, nearly half of them said they choose internet access over owning a car. Even more telling, younger people are getting licensed less. The share of potential drivers 19 and under with licenses fell from 64.5% in 1998 to 46% in 2008. When millennials were asked to rank preferred brands, not a single car brand cracked the top 10. Internet companies did. The car is a metaphor for the shift. The transformation becomes concrete in the rise of car sharing. Instead of buying a vehicle, young people join clubs and pay for mobility in time segments, by the hour, when needed, using smart cards and smartphones to reserve cars parked throughout a city. Some services are private, like Zipcar and Chicago's iGo, but many are nonprofit. Philly Car Share, City Car Share in San Francisco, Our Car in Minneapolis. By 2012, 800,000 Americans belonged to car-sharing services, and 1.7 million people globally were car-sharing across 27 countries. Forecasts for Europe projected explosive growth, fleets rising from 21,000 to 240,000 vehicles by 2020, and membership from 700,000 to 15 million, with revenues reaching £2.6 billion. The deeper story is what car-sharing does to ownership. One study of major car-sharing enterprises found that 80% of members who owned a car beforehand sold it after joining. In households that kept cars, ownership dropped sharply. And the environmental effects are real. In 2009, each shared car replaced about 15 privately owned cars. Members drove a third less, and the change reduced U.S. carbon dioxide emissions by nearly 500,000 tons. Car sharing also triggers crossover behavior, more biking, walking, and public transit. Bike sharing has surged too, aided by smart cards, kiosks, GPS tracking, and now even solar-assisted e-bikes. By 2012, North America had 19 bike share programs and 215,000 users. Globally, more than 100 programs operated 139,000 bicycles. Economically, the logic is brutal for the old model. The average U.S. car sits idle 92% of the time, an absurdly inefficient fixed asset. So why sink household income into ownership, maintenance, insurance, and taxes when you can buy mobility just in time? Even automakers can't escape the contradiction. Here's the capitalist dilemma. Automakers can't afford to ignore car sharing because competitors will grab market presence. But joining the movement accelerates fewer car sales. GM even partnered with Relay Rides and integrated OnStar Access, and Lawrence Burns, a former GM research leader, essentially admits the math that undermines the industry. Shared mobility could be 70% cheaper for citizens, require 1/5 the investment, and need about 80% fewer vehicles to deliver the same mobility. That's the pattern I'm describing throughout this book. It's not the market taming the commons, it's the commons taming the market. And the acceleration is coming, with driverless vehicles already legalized in California, with Nevada and Florida also authorizing them, tested by Google for hundreds of thousands of miles and pursued by nearly every major automaker. The question becomes almost unavoidable. Why own a car at all when you could summon one, be driven, and pay only for the minutes you use? In that simple shift, ownership to access, you can see the larger transformation of the entire economic era. Chapter 14. Crowdfunding Social Capital, Democratizing Currency, Humanizing Entrepreneurship, and Rethinking Work. The near collapse of the global banking system in 2008 scared people to their core. Credit markets seized up, lending froze, and the U.S. government rushed to rescue the biggest banks because they were deemed too big to fail. The public watched in fury as $700 billion in taxpayer money flowed upward to institutions that had behaved recklessly, while millions of ordinary people, families losing homes because they couldn't meet mortgage payments, were treated as if they were simply too small to matter. That moment did something profound. It cracked the mythology of the financial system's legitimacy and pushed people to look for alternatives that felt more transparent, more human, and less predatory. Peer-to-peer social lending and the rise of crowdfunding. Out of that wreckage came a new kind of lending institution built on the internet, peer-to-peer lending, also called social lending. Platforms like Zopa, Lending Club, and Prosper began lending directly to individuals and projects, cutting out traditional banking middlemen and the heavy fixed costs that get passed along as fees and higher interest rates. When you scale lending on the web, the marginal cost of matching lenders to borrowers drops to near zero, and that tends to mean cheaper access to credit. Zopa alone processed more than £414 million in loans, and by the end of 2012, peer-to-peer lenders had brokered $1.8 billion, enough to make big banks pay attention. A newer offshoot is crowdfunding, with Kickstarter as a flagship example. Kickstarter launched in April 2009 and rewired how projects get financed. Creators post a plan, set a funding goal, and pick a deadline. If they don't hit the goal by the deadline, no money changes hands. A built-in safeguard to ensure the project is funded enough to actually proceed. Payments run through Amazon. Kickstarter takes 5%, and Amazon charges another 3 to 5% on average. Importantly, Kickstarter doesn't take ownership in the venture. It's a facilitator, an infrastructure for distributed patronage. By November 2013, Kickstarter had supported 51,000 projects with a 44% success rate, raising over $871 million across 13 categories, from art and music to technology and games. Other platforms offer different compensation models, donations and rewards, goods and services, loans with interest, or equity shares. Even if it's still small relative to the total financial sector, crowdfunding is already helping finance pieces of the Internet of Things build-out, especially in renewable energy. A concrete example, Mosaic and crowdfunded solar. Take Mosaic. It used crowdfunding to raise $1.1 million for a dozen solar projects. In one early offering, Mosaic promised investors a 4.5% return, with minimum participation as low as $25. The co-founder expected it might take a month to raise $313,000. Instead, 435 people funded it fully in 24 hours. By 2013, Mosaic had 10,000 investors ready to finance additional solar installations. One Mosaic-backed system went onto a 26,000 square foot building in Oakland, California, run by the nonprofit Youth Employment Partnership. The system cost $265,000 and was leased by Mosaic to the Youth Employment Partnership. The payoff wasn't abstract. YEP's utility bills dropped 85%, freeing money for programs. And after 10 years, YEP could buy the system, moving toward nearly free power. This is peer-to-peer finance serving distributed renewable infrastructure, exactly the kind of lateral scaling that traditional capital markets struggle to do at the micro level. If anyone had doubts that small players can drive an energy transition, remember Germany. 51% of installed renewable energy is owned by individuals and small businesses, while big utilities own just 7%. Trust, reputation, and commons currencies. Here's the deeper shift. The sharing economy is a hybrid, part market, part commons, and the commons runs on social trust, not buyer beware. That's why collaborative networks rely on reputation rankings to measure social capital the way credit scores measure market risk. ThreadUp enforces a golden rule of quality, rating members on apparel quality, 4 stars, style points, 0 to 10, and punctuality. It even removes repeat offenders who send torn or frayed clothes. TrustCloud goes further, generating a portable trust score from 1 to 1,000 based on consistency, generosity, transparency, responsiveness, and longevity. Couchsurfing, where strangers host strangers for free, uses ratings, references, and a vouching system that requires real-world validation through the network. Then the story widens into money itself. The crash reminds people that currency is ultimately a promissory token backed by collective trust, social capital. When that trust was drained in 2008, people looked for alternatives. Some went to gold, others experimented with community currencies and microcurrencies. There are now more than 4,000 in circulation globally, many tied to labor time stored in time banks, inspired by Egner Kahn's principle of reciprocity. In our exchange, Portland, Maine, time dollars can even be used to pay for healthcare at a nonprofit clinic. Switzerland's WIR credits sales against future purchases among members. Berkshire's in Massachusetts keeps wealth local, exchange $95 and receive $100 in Berkshires and then spend them at participating local businesses. And scaling doesn't stop at the local level. Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer currency emerged partly as an attempt to bypass remittance fee gouging, those 20 to 25% transfer cuts taken by services like Western Union and MoneyGram in emergency scenarios. Humanizing entrepreneurship and rethinking work. Alongside new finance and new currency come new organizational forms that bridge markets and commons. The Benefit Corporation, now legal in multiple U.S. states, gives companies legal room to protect social and environmental commitments from purely profit-driven investor pressure. Patagonia being the headline example. Meanwhile, profits are adopting revenue-generating structures too, including L3C models in several states that allow low profit while prioritizing social mission. All of this converges with work itself. Yes, the IoT and automation are pushing the marginal cost of labor toward near zero in the market economy, machines replacing people. But in the short and midterm, the global built-out of IoT infrastructure, renewables, retrofits, storage, smart grids, electrified transport, will create a massive labor-intensive employment surge over decades. Longer term, more work migrates toward the collaborative commons because social capital and deep human engagement can't be automated in the same way. By mid-century, I expect the center of gravity of employment to shift heavily toward the nonprofit and common sphere, echoing Keynes' old vision, machines handling much of the market production, while human beings invest their time in the cultural, social, and empathic work of civilization. Part 5, Chapter 15, The Sustainable Cornucopia. Classical and neoclassical economics go strangely silent at the very moment our new technologies begin to deliver what they were never designed intellectually to explain, near zero marginal cost. When the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service falls toward zero, the price tends to fall toward nearly free, and with that, profits evaporate. Why? Because capitalism's dynamism is powered by scarcity. Scarcity creates exchange value. Exchange value creates price. Price above cost creates profit. But when marginal cost is near zero, the marketplace can't do what it's built to do. Price scarcity. Because scarcity is being replaced by abundance. Free suddenly means two things at once. Free in price and free from scarcity. Goods and services don't lose their usefulness, they lose their exchange value. They still have use value and share value, but the old logic of capitalism, organizing production and distribution through scarcity-based pricing, starts to look like a machine built for a world that's disappearing. Defining abundance without destroying the earth. Now, abundance is a slippery word. Traditionally, it meant having enough resources to live a flourishing life. Biologists tell us the average person needs roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories a day. Yet, more than 2 billion people live on less than that, and 1 billion are undernourished. With world population expected to rise by 2.5 billion, 35%, by 2050, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization warns food production would need to rise by 70% just to provide adequate nourishment. And yet, on the other side of the ledger, it's just as sobering. The average American consumes 3,750 calories a day. If everyone on Earth consumed at that level, we'd need 4 to 5 Earths. Right now, humanity is consuming the equivalent of 1.5 Earths, meaning it takes about a year and a half for nature to regenerate what we use in a single year. If trends continue, the UN projects that by 2030, we'd need 2 Earths to support our resource needs. So abundance can't simply mean more. It has to mean sustainable sufficiency. And Gandhi's line remains the moral compass. The earth provides enough for need, not for greed. Ecological footprint, the hard metric of sustainability. Today we can measure that boundary with ecological footprint, the biologically productive land and water required to produce what we consume and absorb the waste we generate compared against Earth's biocapacity. In 1961, humanity's footprint was about half the planet's biocapacity. We were living off the interest, not the principal. But by 2008, the footprint of 6.7 billion people was about 18.2 billion global hectares, averaging 2.7 hectares per person on a planet with only about 12 billion global hectares available, 1.8 hectares per person. We were overshooting. The imbalance becomes morally and politically explosive when you look at distribution. The United States, with 4% of the world's population, was using 21% of the Earth's biocapacity, and the average American footprint hit 10 hectares. Globally, the wealthiest 1 billion people used about 3 hectares per person, while the poorest 1.3 billion used about 1. If we're serious about an economy of sustainable abundance, we have to narrow that footprint gap while also confronting population growth. Diet choice as destiny. Lester Brown frames the carrying capacity question through diet. If everyone ate like the U.S., about 800 kilograms of grain per person per year, including feed, today's global grain harvest could support only 2.5 billion people. On an Italian Mediterranean baseline of 400 kilograms, it could support 5 billion. On an Indian baseline of 200 kilograms, as many as 10 billion. And it's not just arithmetic. Brown argues that extremes on the food chain shorten lives. The top suffers disease of affluence, the bottom suffers diseases of poverty, while the Mediterranean pattern correlates with healthier longevity. What makes us happy and why it matters for sustainability. Then there's the psychological evidence. Study after study shows that happiness follows a bell curve. It rises as people escape poverty and reach basic comfort, then plateaus, and eventually can decline as wealth and consumption become burdens, possessions possessing the owner. Materialism fuels envy, superficial relationships, and what psychologists call the hedonistic treadmill. Tim Kasser's conclusion is blunt. The more materialistic values sit at the center of life, the more well-being diminishes. Richard Layard's data is especially revealing. Americans have twice the income they did in 1957, yet the share calling themselves very happy fell from 35% to 30%. And happiness tracks inequality. By 2012, the U.S. ranked 28th of 30 OECD countries in income disparity. Trust has collapsed too. 56% of Americans said most people could be trusted in the 60s, and today it's less than 1/3. This matters because it reframes economics. The things we want most, love, acceptance, belonging, aren't scarce. They're potentially abundant. Advertising exploits that truth, twisting it into a promise that identity and connection can be purchased. Abundance, population, and the electricity lever. So, will near zero-cost abundance trigger runaway consumption and ecological ruin? I don't think so. Scarcity breeds hoarding. Abundance breeds fear. A society meeting basic needs undermines the compulsion to overconsume for security and status. But we still face the hard constraint. we must narrow the footprint of the wealthy and stabilize population growth. Here, the key lever is electricity access. Universal electrification, championed by UN leadership, historically frees women from relentless household labor, enables education, increases security, and drives fertility rates toward 2.1 children per woman. Yet, more than 20% of humanity has no electricity, and another 20% has only unreliable access. The member countries of UNIDO's push for a third industrial revolution infrastructure aims to bring green power to 1.5 billion people and achieve universal access by 2030. If that succeeds, by mid-century, fertility rates could converge toward replacement levels, eventually allowing population to decline toward 5 billion, a scale compatible with living off the Earth's ecological interest. The two wild cards, climate change and cyber terrorism. Even if the blueprint is sound, two threats could derail everything. First, climate change. Atmospheric CO2 rose from about 280 parts per million pre-industrial to 400 parts per million by 2013. The EU once floated 450 ppm by 2050 to aim for 2 degrees C warming. But emissions trajectories suggest that we could blow past that toward 4.5 degrees C by 2100. Each 1 degree C increase boosts atmospheric moisture capacity by 7%, disrupting the hydrological cycle. More intense storms, floods, droughts, wildfires, stronger hurricanes, melting ice caps, rising seas. Ecosystems can't adapt that fast, pushing us into a sixth mass extinction, with scientists warning that half of the Earth's species could vanish by the end of the century. The text grounds this in specific shocks. Typhoon in the Philippines, devastating Philippine cropland at planting season. A cyclone with staggering crop losses in India. Central European floods peaking in Passau, higher than any recorded since 1501. U.S. drought declared disasters across half of the U.S. counties in 2012. And long-range forecasts for crop yields, especially in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and even the U.S., corn and soy, are potentially catastrophic. The second is cyber terrorism. As infrastructure becomes intelligent and interconnected, the threat expands from pranks to coordinated attacks aimed at power grids, finance, transport, and government operations. The nightmare scenario is a prolonged grid failure, months to a year, cascading into water shutdowns, fuel failures, fuel supply collapse, and mass mortality. The vulnerability is amplified dependence on about 2,000 custom-built transformers, many sourced overseas with long replacement timelines. And here's the crucial architectural point. A centralized smart grid can become a single point of failure. A distributed energy internet, microgrids capable of islanding, reduces systemic risk. The internet itself was born from a similar logic. Paul Barron's distributed communications concept, built to survive a nuclear strike, evolved through ARPANET into today's networked world. We saw the problem vividly after Hurricane Sandy. Homes with solar arrays couldn't use their own power because inverters shut down when the grid failed to protect line workers. The solution exists: better inverters and separate panels that can isolate and power essentials. The U.S. military is already investing through spiders, deploying green microgrids at bases like Camp H.M. Smith, Fort Carson, and Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam. So this chapter brings us to a stark conclusion. We have a plausible pathway to a sustainable economy of abundance, but we're racing two clocks. One is the climate clock, the other is the security clock, and neither will wait for our politics to catch up. Chapter 16. A Biosphere Lifestyle. Most conventional economists are still wagering that the extreme productivity being unleashed by the emerging Internet of Things, yes, even if it accelerates us toward near zero marginal cost and expands the collaborative commons, will be absorbed by capitalism and folded neatly back into the old operating system. I think they've got it backwards. What's far more likely is that we're moving into a long hybrid period in which the two systems coexist, but the collaborative commons steadily taking the lead as we approach mid-21st century, and the capitalist market economy settling into a more supplementary role. I'm not saying this because I'm starry-eyed. I'm saying it because we've seen this movie before, and we know the pacing of infrastructure revolutions. In both the first and second industrial revolutions in America and Europe, the early infrastructure was largely put in place in about 30 years, and then it took another 20 years to mature fully and reshape economic life. The third industrial revolution is unfolding even faster. The World Wide Web went online in 1990 and by 2014 had matured into a communications medium connecting much of the human race at near zero marginal cost. And the same exponential logic that built out the communications internet in under 25 years is now pushing the energy internet forward on a comparable timeline toward the prospect of near universal green electricity generation in many countries at near zero marginal cost within another quarter century. The logistics internet is younger, but it's likely to keep pace. And 3D printing, it's already growing faster than the communications internet did at a similar stage. Meanwhile, the social economy on the commons doesn't just grow, it accelerates when prosumers multiply and peer production scales across the Internet of Things. Costs drop not only for producing goods and services, but also for marketing and delivering them. The result? Prosumers and social entrepreneurial firms start capturing a significant share of economic activity, squeezing already thin profit margins in legacy Second Industrial Revolution companies and pushing many of them out of business. That's not ideology. It's competitive math in a world where marginal costs are collapsing. But here's the deeper point. My hope for a near-zero marginal cost society isn't rooted in technology alone. It's rooted in the human story, in the way every great communication energy shift changes not only how we produce and distribute, but how we think and who we feel we belong to. I call this trajectory Homo empathicus. In early forager-hunter societies, the energy regime was the human body itself. Communication was oral language. Consciousness was mythological. And empathy rarely extended beyond blood ties and tribal bonds. Studies suggest that cohesive social units tended to top out around 500 people, the limit of extended family trust and familiarity. Outsiders, when they appeared, could be viewed as non-human, even demonic. Then came the hydraulic civilizations. The Middle East around 3500 BC, China's Yangtze Valley around 3950 BC, and South Asia's Indus Valley around 2500 BC. Centralized irrigation agriculture required mass labor, technical coordination, and centralized management. Stored grain became the new energy regime, supporting urban life, granaries, roads, coinage, markets, and long-distance trade. And to manage it all, we needed the new communication revolution, writing. Consciousness shifted from mythological to theological, and during the Axial Age, roughly 800 BC to 100 AD, great religions emerged, extending empathy beyond blood into fictional families of shared belief. The Golden Rule, do unto others, is the moral signature of that expansion. In the 19th century, coal-powered steam printing converged with coal-powered factories and rail transport. Consciousness shifted toward ideological frames. The nation-state solidified, and people began to think of fellow citizens as an extended family, bound together by national narratives, commemorations, and collective identity. In the 20th century, centralized electrification, oil, automobiles, and mass consumer culture ushered in psychological consciousness, the introspective therapeutic self, coupled with new associational identities that stretched empathy beyond national borders into professional, cultural, and affinity communities in a globalizing world. And importantly, these layers don't replace one another cleanly. They accumulate. Different cultures and different people carry these forms of consciousness in different mixtures. History isn't linear. It has regressions and rediscoveries, like the Italian and Northern Renaissances. But a pattern remains. Consciousness expands and empathy reaches outward. Which brings us to the next leap, biosphere consciousness. If we've expanded empathy from blood ties to religious affiliation to national identity to associational communities, why would the journey end now? The emerging smart infrastructure and interactive communications, energy and logistics internet, spreading nodally across regions and continents, is forming a kind of global neural network. The Internet of Things is connecting everything with every being, making it possible for the first time to experience ourselves as one human family. You can see the leading edge in the young, global classrooms on Skype, social life on Facebook, constant exchange on Twitter, sharing homes and goods online, generating and sharing green electricity, sharing mobility through evolving logistics networks. Their political compass isn't mainly right versus left or capitalism versus socialism. It's centralized and proprietary versus distributed, an open, top-down power versus lateral peer-to-peer collaboration. Open source becomes a generational mantra. And as children learn about their ecological footprint, the collaborative sensibility begins to extend beyond society to the biosphere itself, the understanding that every action affects someone or some creature somewhere else on Earth. The walls between mine and thine begin to thin. Empathy becomes the democratic litmus test. Even compassion toward other species, polar bears, penguins, endangered life in shrinking wild ecosystems, begins to surface, tentative but real. At this stage, it's still more hope than certainty, but there's an unmistakable feeling of possibility in the air. So that wraps up Rifkin's final chapter. Since the book was written in 2014, I'd like to offer my take on the book as I did at the end of Chapter 9 in Part 1. My closing reflection on Rifkin reflects on this: what AI changed, what held up, and what didn't. Looking back from today, with AI moving from the margins to the center of economic and cultural life, Jeremy Rifkin's 2014 argument feels less like a prediction and more like a framework, one that gets some things uncannily right and other things wrong in the way that sweeping historical narratives often do. So let's take them in two parts. First, where Rifkin didn't quite land, especially in an AI-shaped world. First, Rifkin leaned heavily on the idea that near zero marginal cost would spread from information into broad swaths of the real economy fast enough to make markets feel increasingly optional. AI complicates that. Yes, AI can drive the marginal cost of some outputs, text, code, images, design drafts, tutoring, translation, toward nearly free, but it also makes scarcity migrate rather than disappear. Because what becomes scarce isn't always the finished product, it's the inputs and the choke points. Consider these 4 items: compute, GPUs, data centers, energy supply and supply chains; high-quality proprietary data; distribution and attention, who controls the interface, the platform, the default assistant; and trust and verification, what's true, safe, authentic, permitted. In other words, AI can lower costs while simultaneously strengthening centralized control, the opposite of the commons automatically wins storyline. That leads to a second miss: Rifkin's expectation that the collaborative commons would become the dominant form of economic life by mid-century feels less inevitable now. The last decades suggest a strong counterforce, winner-take-most platforms, and now foundation model ecosystems where a handful of firms can set terms for entire markets. And third, he underestimates how easily capitalism can absorb sharing by turning it into a managed service. We didn't just get sharing, we got the sharing economy as a business model: access, rentals, subscriptions, platforms, and intermediaries capturing the value. AI accelerates that. It's increasingly AI as a service mediated by a few gatekeepers. And finally, there's the moral dimension. Rifkin expects empathy to expand with connectivity, nudging us toward biosphere consciousness. The reality is more mixed. Networked life can scale empathy, but it also scales outrage, tribalism, misinformation, and algorithmic polarization. AI doesn't automatically heal that. In some cases, it amplifies that by making persuasion cheaper. So that's the bad news. But where did Rifkin get it right? So where Rifkin was spot on, and AI actually strengthens his case, several of his core instincts look even more accurate because of AI. Digital tech drives marginal costs down in knowledge work. Rifkin correctly saw that information networks would make production and distribution radically cheaper. AI is a turbocharger for that trend. Many tasks that used to require paid experts, drafting, summarizing basic legal templates, customer service, training materials, marketing variants, are now dramatically cheaper and faster. Hybridization is real. Rifkin argued that we would live in a hybrid economy, markets plus commons-like production. That's happening. Open source software still powers enormous portions of the economy, and open ecosystems are now a major force in AI as well. At the same time, commercial layers sit on top, monetizing reliability, compliance, scale, and distribution. The struggle over infrastructure is the struggle over the future. He was absolutely right that the fight wouldn't be just about apps. It would be about who controls the underlying rails. In an AI era, infrastructure now clearly includes cloud platforms, model weights, chips, data pipelines, and energy grids. Governance and control of those layers is where power concentrates. Energy matters more than tech optimists admit. Rifkin's insistence that communications revolutions can't be separated from energy regimes looks sharper today. AI is energy-hungry. Data centers, model training, and always-on inference make the link between digital progress and the energy system impossible to ignore. If anything, AI has made the energy internet question more urgent, not less. And then big institutions are not immortal. His point about constant churn, companies rising and falling across paradigm shifts, also holds. AI is already reshaping which firms gain leverage, which lose pricing power, and which must reinvent themselves. So what's the right closing takeaway? Rifkin's biggest overreach wasn't his diagnosis that technology could erode scarcity. It was the assumption that the erosion of scarcity would automatically translate into decentralization, empathy, and commons governance. AI shows us something more sobering and more useful. Near zero cost production can empower communities, creators, and small teams, but it can also empower centralized platforms to capture the value of abundance. The future isn't commons or capitalism. It's a contest over whether the tools of abundance are governed as public serving infrastructure or as private toll roads. So if we're closing out this podcast with one practical moral from Rifkin in the age of AI, it's this. The outcome isn't pre-written by the technology. The technology only sets the terrain. The real question, the one that determines whether abundance becomes humane and sustainable, is who owns the rails, who sets the rules, and whether we choose to build systems that convert intelligence into shared capability instead of just concentrated profit. So that's the end of my take and the end of the book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society by Jeremy Rifkin. I really enjoyed the book. I enjoyed it when I read it back in 2016, and I enjoyed reading it and then running the analysis of where he was spot on and where he had a miss. And of course, nobody's a soothsayer. There are no crystal balls. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Remember that our website is www.innoguide.net, where we have many resources for innovators, including those who want to build medical products with or without embedded AI, those who want to use AI in their work streams for product development, those who want to get timeline slip under control in their medical product development, and those who want to learn how to use automation to help with that process of building products. Know you'll be learning it from someone who's worked in medtech for 30 years and has been using large language models since they emerged in 2022. I want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this, and I really want to thank you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you next time. That's a wrap.